the year of our Lord, 1886. The world had shrunk to the size of a filthy train car, rattling and clattering its way across a land so vast and empty, it seemed God had forgotten to finish it. For two sisters of the Endi, the people, it was a cage hurtling them toward an unknown fate, propelled by the lies of white men. Ayana, the elder by 4 winters, sat as still as a stone, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon that bled into the cracked earth. Her face was a mask of stoic resolve, but inside, her spirit was a coiled snake, ready to strike. Every jolt of the train was an insult, every leering glance from the other passengers a fresh wound. She kept one hand tucked into the folds of her worn skirt, her fingers wrapped around the smooth, familiar handle of the knife her father had given her. It was all she had left of him, of her home, of the life that had been stolen. Beside her, Taji huddled close, her head resting on Ayana's shoulder. She was the moon to Ayana's sun, softer, her spirit more given to wonder than to war. Her eyes, wide and dark as a forest pool at midnight, took in everything: the strange, pale faces of the white men and women, their peculiar clothes, the way the sun baked the paint off the sides of the train car. She tried to see the adventure in it, the promise that had been whispered to them by the smooth-tongued trader, a man named Henderson. Good work, he had promised, his smile showing too many teeth. In the north, sewing fine dresses for wealthy ladies. You are clever with a needle, aren't you? They were. Their mother had taught them the intricate patterns of their people, the way to stitch stories into leather and cloth with sinew and quill. The lie was plausible enough, a tiny seed of hope planted in the barren soil of their grief. Their family, their band, had been shattered, decimated by blue-coated soldiers and the coughing sickness that followed. They were orphans, adrift in a world that saw them as curiosities at best, and vermin at worst. The promise of work, of a life away from the reservations that were little more than open-air prisons, was a song they desperately wanted to believe. So they had followed him, 2 frightened girls clutching small bundles of their belongings, onto the iron horse that screamed and belched black smoke. But the journey was not north. With every passing day, the sun grew hotter, the land more desolate, the green faded to brown, then to a blistering, angry red. The other passengers, mostly rough men with sun-scorched faces and cold eyes, looked at them not as future seamstresses, but as something else entirely. Ayana felt their gazes like insects crawling on her skin. "Sister," Tazi whispered, her voice barely audible above the screech of the wheels. "This does not feel like the north." "Hush," Ayana murmured back, her eyes never leaving the window. "We are strong. We will face what comes." But the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. The train finally shuddered to a halt in a town that seemed to have been carved from dust and despair. It was called Purgatory Flats. A single wide street was flanked by raw timber buildings, their fronts blasted by sand and sun. Saloons, a general store, a blacksmith's forge belching heat into the already sweltering air. There was no life here, only existence. Men stopped and stared as they were herded off the train by Henderson, their moccasins sinking into the thick, powdery dust. The white women pulled their children close, their faces pinched with disapproval and fear. Henderson wasted no time. He steered them toward a dilapidated wagon hitched to 2 weary-looking mules. The man holding the reins was thin and weasel-faced, chewing on a piece of straw. "This is as far as I go," Henderson said, avoiding their eyes. He pressed a small, heavy purse into the driver's hand. "You know the place. Get them there before sundown." "What is this?" Ayana demanded, her voice low and dangerous. "Where is the sewing house? Where are the ladies?" Henderson finally looked at her, and his slick smile was gone, replaced by a cold indifference. "Change of plans. There's a good man waiting for you, a rancher. He'll take care of you." He patted Tazi on the head as one would a dog. She flinched away. "You'll be fine. It's a good life." Before they could protest further, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the nearest saloon without a backward glance. The driver grunted, gesturing with his head toward the back of the wagon. "Get in!" Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ayanna's composure. They had been sold, like cattle, like beads and blankets. The full weight of the betrayal crashed down on her. She grabbed Tazi's hand, her knuckles white. For a moment, she considered running. But where would they go? They were two Apache girls in a white man's town, in a land that was no longer theirs. To run was to die of thirst in the desert or to be hunted for sport. With heavy hearts and leaden feet, they climbed into the back of the wagon. It smelled of sweat, manure, and something sour. The driver cracked his whip, and the mules lurched forward, pulling them out of Purgatory Flats and into the vast, silent wilderness that surrounded it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Enoch Hale watched the sun crawl across the immense, cloudless sky. From the porch of his small, sturdy cabin, he could see for miles in every direction. The land was his only companion, a harsh and demanding mistress. The earth was baked and cracked, thirsty for a rain that never seemed to come. Saguaro cacti stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels, their shadows stretching long and skeletal in the late afternoon light. The only sound was the incessant wind, a low moan that carried the scent of dust and dry sagebrush. Occasionally, the sharp, piercing cry of a red-tailed hawk would slice through the silence as it circled high above. A lonely hunter in an empty sky. Enoch was a giant of a man, built on a scale that matched the landscape. His shoulders were as wide as a doorway, his hands thick and calloused from years of wrestling a living from this unforgiving soil. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, as if saving his energy for a fight that was always just around the corner. His face, framed by a thick, unkempt beard the color of dried wheat, was a roadmap of solitude and quiet sorrow. His eyes, a startlingly pale blue, held a deep and abiding loneliness. He had built this ranch with his own 2 hands, raised the cabin from the earth, dug the well until his fingers bled. He had done it all for a woman who now lay buried beneath a simple wooden cross on a small rise behind the house, taken by the fever 5 years ago. Since then, the silence in the cabin had become a physical presence, a weight that settled on his shoulders each night. He was not a man of many words, nor was he comfortable in the company of others. But the silence had finally become too much to bear. And so, in a moment of quiet desperation, he had done what other lonely men on the frontier did. He had sent a letter, along with a significant portion of his savings, to an agency back east. He had answered an advertisement for mail-order brides, hardy, God-fearing women for respectable settlers. He had requested 2 sisters, if possible. He thought it would be kinder, that they might find comfort in each other's company in this vast, empty place. He wasn't looking for romance. He was looking for a cure for the silence. He was looking for someone to share the burden of the endless days and the long, dark nights. Their names were to be Martha and June. The agency's letter had said they were good-natured farm girls from Ohio, orphans who were looking for a new start. He had built a small extension onto the cabin for them, bought new linens from the general store, and scrubbed the floor until his knees ached. Now, he watched the plume of dust on the horizon grow larger, resolving itself into the shape of a wagon and 2 mules. His heart, a muscle long dormant, gave a strange, uncertain thump against his ribs. It was a feeling he couldn't name, not excitement, precisely, but a profound and tremulous stirring of hope. The wagon rattled to a stop in front of the cabin. The weasel-faced driver, a man Enoch recognized as Silas, a hired hand from town, stayed in his seat. He merely grunted and jerked a thumb toward the back. And then they stepped down. The first thing Enoch noticed was that they were not the fair-haired, rosy-cheeked farm girls he had pictured from the advertisement's description, not Martha and June from Ohio. The 2 women who stood before him were of the people, Their skin was the color of rich earth, their hair as black and gleaming as a raven's wing. They were dressed in worn, plain cotton dresses, clearly provided for the journey. But underneath, he could see the tops of beaded moccasins. They stood with a rigid dignity that seemed at odds with the terrified, hunted look in their eyes. The older one, Ayanna, had a face that looked as if it were carved from stone, her jaw set, her dark eyes flashing with a defiant fire. She scanned the homestead, her gaze missing nothing: the cabin, the barn, Enoch himself. She was assessing threats, calculating odds. The younger one, Taji, stood slightly behind her sister, one hand clutching Ayanna's arm. Her fear was more open, her eyes wide with a bewildered innocence that tugged at something deep inside Enoch. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind swirled dust around their feet. The mules stamped impatiently. Enoch was a man of the West. He had seen conflict with the Apache, had heard the stories, the fear, the hatred that poisoned the air in towns like Purgatory Flats. But looking at these two women, all he saw was two lost, terrified human beings, brought to his doorstep by a cruel mistake. Silas, the driver, broke the spell. He tossed a small, dusty bundle onto the ground, their meager belongings, and then pointed to a sealed envelope Enoch had left tucked in the porch railing. "Payment's there," he grunted. He snatched the envelope, counted the money with a greedy quickness, and without another word, he cracked his whip. The wagon creaked, groaned, and began the long journey back to town, leaving the three of them alone in the vast, indifferent landscape. The finality of the wagon's departure settled over them. The mistake was now a reality. Ayanna took a step forward. "Where is the man Henderson?" she asked, her English clipped and careful. "He promised work." Enoch stared, his mind struggling to catch up. A deep, slow anger began to burn in his gut, not at these women, but at the faceless men who had deceived them, and him. He shook his massive head slowly. "There is no Henderson here, no work." He looked down at his own hands, then back at them. I was expecting someone else." He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out the letter from the agency. His finger, thick as a sausage, traced the names. "Martha and June," he read aloud, his voice a low rumble. The blood drained from Tazi's face. Ayanna's expression hardened. The last flicker of hope in her eyes extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of betrayal. They understood. "No," Ayanna said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "We are not brides. We are not for sale." She grabbed Tazi's hand. "We will leave." Enoch looked at the horizon, at the endless expanse of cracked earth and rock under the baking sun. The wagon was already a tiny, shimmering speck in the distance. To walk from here to town without water or knowledge of the land was not leaving. It was suicide. His gaze fell upon them again. Two solitary figures against the immense backdrop of the wilderness. Their world shattered, their futures a terrifying blank. They were so far from home, so utterly alone, and in their shared predicament, in this terrible, cruel mix-up. He felt a strange kinship. His own loneliness seemed to reach out and recognize theirs. He was a simple man, a man of faith, though he rarely set foot in a church. He believed in the quiet hand of Providence, in a plan larger than his own understanding. And as he looked at the two frightened Apache sisters who had been sent to his ranch by mistake, who were not the women he had paid for, but were the women who were *here*, a thought, strange and profound, took root in his heart. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and unused. "I was expecting two women," he said, his voice low and heavy. "And two women have arrived." He looked up at the vast, empty sky, as if seeking an answer there. "I don't understand the Lord's ways." He looked back at them, his pale blue eyes filled with a bewildered sincerity. "But perhaps God sent you." Ayanna flinched as if struck. She pulled Tazi closer, shielding her with her body, her hand tightening on the hidden knife. To her, his words were not a statement of faith. They were a claim of ownership. "We will not stay," she insisted, her voice trembling but firm. "The man is gone." Enoch stated the simple, brutal fact. Your papers, your belongings. Did you have a return ticket?" The question hung in the air. Of course they didn't. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and the small bundles Silas had thrown in the dust. They were trapped. Seeing the raw panic in their eyes, Enoch softened his tone. He raised his hands, palms open, a universal sign of peace. "I will not harm you," he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. This is a mistake, a terrible mistake, but you cannot walk from here. You will die." He gestured toward the small, clean barn that stood a short distance from the cabin. "You can stay there. There is water from the well, food. It will be a place to stay. Just until you can find your way home." He looked at them, his gaze pleading for them to understand. "I give you my word. No harm will come to you in this place. This is just shelter." Ayanna stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. She saw none. What she saw was a man as baffled and trapped by this situation as they were. He was a giant, yes, and a white man, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes that was not threatening. It was familiar. It was the look of someone who had lost everything. There was no choice. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The night would bring cold and predators. Here, at least, was a roof and a well, and the promise of a man who, for some reason she could not yet fathom, she was beginning to believe. Slowly, reluctantly, she gave a single, sharp nod. Without another word, Enoch turned and walked back into his cabin, the heavy wooden door closing behind him with a sound of utter finality, leaving the two Apache sisters alone under the vast, darkening sky. They were strangers in a strange land, their lives now entwined with that of the giant who believed they were a gift from God. The first dawn at the Hale Ranch broke not with the gentle song of birds, but with the stark, silent announcement of light and heat. Inside the barn, Ayanna was already awake. She had not truly slept, but had drifted in a shallow, restless state of high alert, her hand never straying from the knife. She watched the slivers of morning light pierce the gaps in the plank walls, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. Beside her, Taji slept the deep, exhausted sleep of the young, her face soft and untroubled for a few precious hours. Ayanna rose silently, her moccasins making no sound on the hay-strewn floor. She moved to the barn's large, open doorway and peered out. The landscape was the same, a vast, brutal canvas of red earth and pale sky. The cabin stood about 50 yards away, a plume of smoke already rising from its stone chimney. The giant, Enoch, was awake. She watched the cabin as a hawk watches a field mouse, noting every detail: the single window, the heavy wooden door, the way the structure was built to withstand a siege. It was a fortress for a man who lived alone. Her first day was a campaign of reconnaissance, while Taji remained close to the relative safety of the barn, her wide eyes observing everything from the doorway. Ayanna explored the perimeter of the homestead. She moved with a fluid, ghost-like grace, keeping to the shadows cast by the stable, the water trough, the few scraggly ironwood trees that clung stubbornly to life. She tested the latch on the horse's small corral, noted the location of the well and the woodpile. She was mapping out lines of escape, assessing the resources of this man who was now, for all intents and purposes, their captor. The knife was a cold, reassuring weight in her hand. She was a warrior in a cage, and she would know the shape of its bars. Enoch was acutely aware of her movements. He was a man attuned to the subtle shifts of his environment, and her presence was a constant, thrumming vibration on the edge of his senses. He tried to act as he always did, yet his every motion felt clumsy and loud. He fed his lone, aging horse, milked his 2 goats, and chopped wood. The rhythmic thud of his axe, the only sound punctuating the tense silence. He was a man who knew how to command the land, but he had no idea how to care for people. His attempts at hospitality were gruff and awkward. He left a bucket of fresh water and a tin plate with 2 hard biscuits and a piece of goat cheese near the barn door, then retreated quickly to his cabin as if he'd left a tribute for some wild, timid spirit. Taji looked at the food with hungry eyes, but Ayana forbade her from touching it until she had inspected it, sniffing it suspiciously before finally nodding her assent. They ate, huddled in the shadows, their backs to the wall, like cornered animals. The day stretched on, an eternity of silent observation. Taji, growing bolder, found a small patch of shade and began weaving stray pieces of hay into the shape of a doll, her youthful spirit finding a way to create beauty even in this desolate place. Ayana continued her watch, her posture never relaxing, her gaze sweeping from the horizon to the cabin door and back again. Enoch remained mostly inside his fortress, the silence between the 2 small buildings growing heavier with each passing hour. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Night fell, bringing with it a deceptive coolness and a canopy of stars so bright and dense they seemed close enough to touch. The darkness did not bring peace. For Ayana, it sharpened her grief, stripping away the distractions of the day and leaving her alone with her memories. In the deep, velvety black of the barn, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket Enoch had left for them, she allowed the iron wall of her composure to crack. Enoch sat at his rough-hewn table, the flame of a single tallow lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of his cabin. He was trying to mend a piece of leather harness, but his hands were restless, his mind elsewhere. The silence he had once craved now felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken presence of the 2 women in his barn. Then he heard it. It was not a loud sound. It was a faint, choked gasp, carried on the night wind. He froze, his head cocked, listening. It came again, the sound of a soul breaking, a grief so profound it could no longer be contained in a human heart. It was the sound of weeping, desperately stifled, as if the one crying was ashamed of the noise. He knew, instinctively, that it was the older one, Ayana, the stone-faced warrior who had watched him all day with eyes like chips of obsidian. The sound tore through him, a pain that was both foreign and deeply familiar. He knew that kind of grief, the kind that comes in the dead of night when you are sure no one can hear you. It was the sound of utter, absolute loss. He imagined her, huddled in the dark, mourning the parents he now felt certain were gone, the people she had been stolen from, the life that was lost to her forever. His first instinct was to go to her, to offer, what? Words. He had none. Comfort. He didn't know how. He was a creature of solitude. He would be an intruder on her sorrow, a clumsy bear trying to soothe a wounded bird, but to do nothing felt like a sin. His eyes fell on a small wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it. The scent of dried lavender and cedar filled the small room. Inside, folded neatly, were his wife Sarah's things. He reached in and pulled out a small, linen handkerchief. It was yellowed with age, but the embroidery she had so painstakingly stitched along the edges was still bright, tiny blue forget-me-nots. It was the only delicate, beautiful thing he owned. He took the lamp and walked to the door, his large frame moving with uncharacteristic quietness. The cool night air hit his face. He walked to the barn, his boots making soft thuds in the dust. The muffled sobs continued, rhythmic and heartbreaking. He did not go in. He did not call out. He simply reached out and gently placed the folded handkerchief on the edge of the open doorway, resting on a clean spot on the frame where he knew she would see it in the morning. Then, as silently as he had come, he retreated to his cabin, leaving his small, inadequate offering to stand against an ocean of sorrow. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next morning, the handkerchief was gone. It was not mentioned. No glance was exchanged, but something had shifted. The air was still tense, but the sharp, brittle edge of hostility had softened, replaced by a deep and wary stillness. The first crack in the silence came through work. Ayanna was too proud to accept charity, and the idleness was a poison to her spirit. She watched Enoch work with his horse, a sway-backed gelding named Elijah. The man's hands, which seemed so large and crude, were surprisingly gentle as he curried the horse's coat and checked its hooves. Ayanna knew horses. Her people were masters of them. She walked out of the barn and approached the corral. Enoch stopped, watching her, his hand resting on Elijah's flank. She didn't speak. She simply picked up a spare brush, her movements economical and expert, and began working on the horse's tangled mane. Enoch watched her for a moment, then nodded once, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, and went back to his own work. They worked in silence, side by side, the rhythmic scrape of the brushes a form of communication. Taji, meanwhile, was drawn to Enoch's evening ritual. After his supper, he would sit on the porch steps and whittle, his large knife peeling away curls of wood from a piece of cottonwood branch with mesmerizing skill. One evening, Tazi crept closer, her curiosity outweighing her fear, and sat on the ground a few feet away, watching him. Enoch finished the small bird he was carving and held it out to her. She hesitated, looking from the bird to his face. He set it on the step between them and picked up a fresh piece of wood. He pulled a smaller knife from his pocket and offered it to her. Handle first. "The wood tells you what it wants to be," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You just have to listen." Taji took the knife. Her small fingers, so adept with a needle, were clumsy at first, but Enoch was patient. He didn't guide her hand, but showed her with his own how to angle the blade, how to follow the grain, and in the quiet twilight, under the patient tutelage of the silent giant, Tazi began to carve her own simple shape, a tentative bridge being built, shaving by shaving. The first real conversations happened in the spaces between chores. They were not conversations of the heart, but of the land. "That plant," Ayanna said one afternoon, pointing with her chin toward a dusty green shrub with small yellow flowers. "The root makes a good tea for a fever." Enoch stopped his work and looked at it. "I always thought it was poison." "Some parts are," she replied. "You have to know which." They began to exchange knowledge. He showed her which parts of his land held water longest after a rare rain. She showed him how to track rabbits and which insects signaled a change in the weather. They spoke of survival, the common language of all who lived in this harsh place. One evening, as they stood by the corral, watching the sun set, Ayanna looked out at the vast, empty expanse that Enoch called his own. "Why do you stay here?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Alone." Enoch leaned against the fence, the wood groaning under his weight. He was silent for a long time. "Had a reason once," he said finally. He nodded toward the small hill behind the cabin. "She's buried there. This land, it's all I have left of her." Ayanna did not offer words of sympathy. Her people did not waste words on what was already understood. She simply nodded, acknowledging his loss, a quiet recognition passing between two people who had been hollowed out by grief. "We lost our parents," she said, her own admission a stone dropped into a deep well. To the soldiers. It was the first time she had offered a piece of her past. Enoch received it with the gravity it deserved. He didn't ask questions. He didn't say he was sorry. He just stood with her in the fading light, sharing the weight of their ghosts. But their fragile peace was contained within the boundaries of the ranch. The world outside had not forgotten them. A week after their arrival, Enoch had to ride into Purgatory Flats for flour and salt. He was gone the entire day, and a nervous energy settled over the sisters. When he returned at dusk, the grim, hard set of his jaw told them something was wrong. He unloaded his supplies without a word, his movements clipped and angry. Finally, as he was leading Elijah back to the stable, He stopped. "There's talk in the town," he said, his back still to them. "Silas has a big mouth." He turned, and his pale eyes were troubled. "They're saying things. That I'm keeping 2 Indian women out here?" He spat on the ground. "There's a group of men, vigilantes they call themselves, said they might ride out to check on the situation." He looked at Ayanna, his gaze direct and heavy. "They are not good men. If you see riders coming, you take your sister and you hide. Go deep into the rocks behind the cabin. Don't make a sound until I come for you." The sanctuary had been breached. The hatred of the town, a poison that had been festering just over the horizon, was now threatening to spill onto their land. The fragile trust they had begun to build was about to face its first brutal test. The world was coming to reclaim them, and the giant who had taken them in by mistake was now their only shield. They waited. The 2 days following Enoch's warning were stretched thin with a silent, simmering dread. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching riders. Every shadow seemed to hold a man with a gun. Ayanna sharpened her knife until the edge was a whisper of light. She instructed Tazi on the quickest path to the rock formations behind the cabin, a jumble of granite and ironstone that offered 1,000 hiding places. They would not be taken again. On the 3rd day, they came. Ayanna saw them first, a smudge of dust on the eastern horizon that slowly resolved into 5 riders. She grabbed Tazi's arm, her voice low and urgent. "Go, now, as we practiced. Do not make a sound." Tazi's eyes were wide with terror, but she obeyed instantly, scrambling out the back of the barn and vanishing into the rugged landscape like a fawn into the forest. Ayanna melted back into the deepest, darkest corner of the barn, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. From a narrow crack between 2 warped planks, she could see the front of the cabin. Enoch had seen them too. He didn't run or hide. He simply stopped his work at the woodpile, laid his axe down deliberately, and walked to the front of his cabin. He stood on the porch, his massive frame filling the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a mountain, immovable and silent, waiting for the storm to break against him. The riders reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, their mounts snorting and stamping in the dust. The man in the lead was Caleb Brody, a local rancher with a mean streak and a self-appointed authority. His face was thin and weathered, his eyes small and suspicious. The others were a mix of scruffy farmhands and town loafers, men who found courage in numbers and purpose in the persecution of others. "Hail," Brody said, his voice carrying a sneer. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Enoch's boot. "Heard some strange stories in town." Enoch's expression did not change. His pale blue eyes were as flat and cold as a winter sky. "That's so?" "Heard you took in some strays," Brody continued, letting his gaze drift pointedly toward the barn. "Some Apache women. Silas was saying you were expecting mail-order brides. Seems there was a mix-up." The men behind him chuckled, a low, ugly sound. From her hiding place, Ayanna felt a surge of cold fury. They spoke of her and her sister as if they were livestock that had wandered into the wrong pasture. Enoch's voice, when it came, was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very planks of the porch. "Silas talks too much. Folks are concerned." "Hail," Brody pressed, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol at his hip. "It ain't right. A man living out here alone with them. We came to see for ourselves, to make sure everything is proper." Enoch uncrossed his arms. He took 1 step forward, to the very edge of the porch, and the movement was so deliberate and menacing that Brody's horse took a nervous step back. Enoch was a head taller than any of them, and on his own land. He seemed to draw power from the very earth beneath his feet. "There's nothing to see," Enoch said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The women you're talking about are my kin, my cousins." A murmur went through the riders. Brody's eyes narrowed. "Cousins? You ain't got no kin in this territory. Hail, and they sure as hell don't look like any cousins I've ever seen." "My late wife's family," Enoch said. the lie coming out smooth and hard as river stone. Her mother was a Cherokee woman. They've come down from the territories to stay with me for a spell. They had some trouble up north. He let his gaze sweep over each of the men, a silent challenge. Do you have a problem with a man looking after his own family? Brody. The lie was audacious, but it was rooted in a sliver of possibility that gave them pause. To call him a liar to his face was to invite a confrontation that none of them, even with their numbers, truly wanted. Enoch Hale was known as a quiet man, but it was the quiet of a slumbering grizzly. No one was eager to see him roused. Brody hesitated, chewing on the inside of his cheek. He looked from Enoch's unyielding face to the silent cabin, to the empty barn. There was no proof, only rumor. To push further would be to start a fight he might not finish. See that you keep things proper out here, Hale, he said finally, pulling on his reins. It was a retreat disguised as a warning. We'll be watching. He wheeled his horse around, and the others followed, kicking up a cloud of contemptuous dust as they rode away. Enoch stood on the porch, unmoving, until they were once again just a smudge on the horizon. Only then did his shoulders slump, just for a second, the immense tension draining out of him. He turned and called out, his voice rough with strain. It's safe. You can come out. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The vigilante's visit was a violation. It had shattered the fragile peace of the homestead and reminded them all that the ranch was not an island, but a small, besieged outpost in a hostile world. The lie Enoch had told hung in the air between them, a testament to the danger they were in, and the lengths he would go to protect them. The barn, once a simple shelter, now felt temporary and exposed. The next morning, Enoch began to build. Without discussion or announcement, he started laying the foundation for a small addition to the side of his cabin. He worked with a furious, single-minded energy, his axe ringing through the clear morning air as he felled 2 sturdy ironwood trees. He sawed planks, squared timbers, and hammered pegs, his sweat soaking through his shirt and plastering it to his broad back. Ayanna and Tazi watched him, their initial confusion giving way to a slow, dawning understanding. He was not repairing a fence or building a new trough. He was building a room. For them. It was an act of profound significance. It was a wall of wood and stone against the hatred of the outside world. It was a statement, made not with words, but with sweat and splinters and the solid thud of a hammer driving nails home. It said, asterisk, you are not temporary. You are not hiding in my barn. You belong here. Ayanna began to watch Enoch in a new way. She had seen his solitude, his gruffness, his quiet grief. Now she saw his strength not as a threat, but as a shield. She began to notice the small things. She saw the way his calloused, powerful hands could be impossibly gentle. One afternoon, his horse, Elijah, came up lame, a sharp stone having bruised the frog of his hoof. Ayanna watched from a distance as Enoch knelt in the dust, cradling the horse's leg in his lap. He cleaned the wound with a soft cloth, his voice a low, soothing murmur that she could not quite make out. He spoke to the animal with more tenderness than she had ever heard him use with a person. In that moment, he was not a giant, or a white man, or her captor. He was just a gentle soul, caring for another living creature. A crack appeared in the armor around her heart. That crack was ripped wide open 2 weeks later. It was a hot, still afternoon. Taji, ever drawn to the small bits of beauty in the harsh landscape, was collecting brightly colored pebbles near a rocky outcrop a short distance from the cabin. Ayanna was mending one of her dresses in the shade of the newly built room, its raw pine walls smelling of the forest. Enoch was replacing a loose handle on the well bucket. A scream shattered the afternoon's peace. It was a sound of pure terror, sharp and piercing. Ayanna! Both Ayanna and Enoch moved at the same instant. Ayanna dropped her sewing and sprinted toward the sound, but Enoch, despite his size, moved with a shocking, explosive speed. He vaulted the low corral fence and covered the ground in great, ground-eating strides, reaching Tazi first. She was on the ground, clutching her ankle, her face a mask of white-hot pain and fear. Coiled a few feet away, its tail buzzing an angry warning, was a diamondback rattlesnake. Ayana's blood ran cold. She saw the 2 small puncture marks on Tazi's ankle, already beginning to swell and discolor. Enoch didn't hesitate. He pulled the huge Bowie knife from the sheath on his belt. In one swift motion, he tore a strip from the bottom of his own shirt and tied it tightly around Tazi's leg, just above the knee. Then he knelt, his face grim, and pressed his mouth to the wound. He sucked, his cheeks hollowing, and spat a mouthful of blood and venom onto the red dust. He did it again and again, his movements frantic, desperate. Ayana, an expert in the healing arts of her own people, stood frozen for a half-second, stunned by the raw, primal ferocity of his actions. He was trying to draw the poison from her sister's body into his own. When he was done, he scooped Tazi into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He began to run toward the cabin, his face a mess of her blood and his own sweat. It was then that Ayana saw the look in his eyes. It was not the calm resolve of a man handling an emergency. It was sheer, unadulterated terror. As he stumbled near the porch, his leg catching on a loose stone, a sound was torn from his throat. It was not a word. It was a guttural roar of pure agony and despair. The sound of a man who believed he was watching the most precious thing in the world die in his arms. He looked down at Tazi's pale, unconscious face and whispered her name, his voice breaking. "Taji! Oh, God, no!" In that moment, everything changed for Ayana. She saw past the lie he had told, past the room he had built. She saw his heart, laid bare and bleeding. The care he felt for them was not born of pity or a misplaced sense of duty. It was real. It was fierce. The thought that he might lose Tazi was tearing him apart. She snapped out of her paralysis and ran into the cabin ahead of him. "Put her on the bed," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority he had never heard from her before. He obeyed without question, laying Tazi gently on his own cot. For the next 2 days, they were a team, united in a silent, desperate vigil. Ayana used her knowledge of herbs, making a poultice to draw out the swelling and brewing a weak tea from the root she had shown him to fight the fever. Enoch followed her instructions, fetching cool water from the well, holding Tazi's hand, his huge frame hunched over the small cot in a constant, prayerful watch. During the long, quiet hours of the night, as Tazi's fevered breathing filled the small cabin, they talked. The walls between them, already weakened, finally crumbled into dust. "My wife, Sarah," Enoch said, his voice rough, staring into the flame of the lamp. "It was the pox that took her. I watched her burn with a fever just like this. There was nothing I could do, nothing. I felt so helpless." He looked at Ayana, his pale eyes swimming with the memory of that old pain. "Tonight, when I saw your sister, I felt it all over again." Ayana listened, her heart aching with a strange mix of her own sorrow and his. The shared experience of watching a loved one hover between life and death created a bond stronger than any words. She found herself telling him things she had never told another soul. "When the soldiers came to our village," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "they brought the coughing sickness with them first. Many of our people died before the first shot was even fired." She looked at her own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "My parents, they died in the raid, but I survived. I and Taji and a few others. The white people in the fort, they would point at us. They would call me Plague Woman, the girl from the village that was wiped out. They looked at me like I was a curse." She finally lifted her head and met his gaze, her own dark eyes naked and vulnerable. "For so long, I have felt that I carry that death with me, that I am unclean." Enoch reached out, his large, rough hand covering hers. His touch was not forceful, but it was solid, grounding. It was the touch of a man who understood what it was to be branded by loss, "You are not a curse, Ayanna," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are a survivor." On the third morning, Tazi's fever broke. She opened her eyes, and the first person she saw was Enoch, who had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head resting on his arms. The second person she saw was Ayanna, who was smiling, her face wet with tears. The storm had passed. They had weathered it together. And in the quiet aftermath, the homestead no longer felt like a refuge or a prison. For the first time, it felt like a home. Life settled into a new rhythm after Tazi's recovery. The addition to the cabin was now a proper room, small and simple, but with a sturdy door and a real window. It was their space, a tangible symbol of their permanence. Taji filled it with small treasures, uniquely shaped stones, a hawk's feather, the little wooden birds Enoch had carved for her. It was the first safe place she had known since her world had been burned to the ground. The three of them moved around each other in a quiet, comfortable dance of shared chores and lengthening silences. A fragile family forged in the crucible of mutual survival. But beneath the calm surface, an unspoken tension coiled, a current of awareness that flowed primarily between Enoch and Ayanna. It was in the way his gaze would linger on her for a moment too long as she braided her long, black hair in the morning sun. It was in the way she would watch his hands, so large and powerful, as he expertly mended a fence or calmed a nervous goat. They had shared their deepest wounds, and in doing so, had created a new and dangerous intimacy. They stood on opposite sides of a chasm, connected by a thread of shared grief, terrified to look down, yet unable to look away from each other. The land, as if sensing the unresolved storm in their hearts, decided to break its own long silence. It began as a strange stillness in the air, a heavy, humid pressure that clamped down on the valley. The sky, usually a vast, bleached blue, turned a bruised, yellowish gray. The birds fell silent. Enoch stood on the porch, his eyes on the horizon, sniffing the air like an animal. "A storm's coming," he said, his voice low. "A bad one." By late afternoon, the world had gone dark. The clouds, which had gathered in thick, menacing layers, unleashed their fury. It was not a gentle rain. It was a biblical deluge, a solid sheet of water that hammered the tin roof of the cabin and turned the hard-packed earth into a churning sea of red mud. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, followed by claps of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the small house. The dry creek bed at the edge of the property, a dusty snake of rocks and sand for years, became a roaring, brown river in a matter of minutes. The world shrank to the dimensions of the small cabin, isolated and besieged by the elements. Taji, who had a child's fear of thunder, retreated to their new room soon after their meager supper, wrapping herself in her blankets and falling into a deep, protected sleep. Ayanna, however, was invigorated by the storm. It echoed the wildness in her own spirit. She stood by the single window in the main room, watching the raw power of the weather, feeling its restless energy. Enoch sat by the hearth, feeding logs into the fire, the flames casting a warm, flickering glow that pushed back against the violent darkness outside. For a long time, the only sounds were the roar of the rain, the crackle of the fire, and the frantic drumming of their own hearts. The small space was charged, thick with unspoken thoughts and feelings. "I have not seen rain like this since I was a child," Ayanna said, her voice soft, not turning from the window. "In the mountains, it would make the whole world smell of pine and wet earth." "It washes everything clean," Enoch replied, his gaze fixed on the flames. For a time, she finally turned to look at him. The firelight carved his face into stark plains and deep shadows, making him look like some ancient, weathered monument. His loneliness, usually a quiet background hum, was now a palpable presence in the room. She felt its echo in her own soul. "Are you ever afraid, Enoch?" she asked. "Out here, all alone." He considered the question for a long moment. "I used to be," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "After Sarah passed. The silence. It was a living thing. I thought it would swallow me whole, but you get used to it. You learn to live with the ghosts." He finally lifted his head and looked at her, and his pale eyes held a raw honesty. "It's harder. Now." "Harder?" "The silence is gone," he said simply, "and I find I don't want it to come back." The admission hung between them, as real and elemental as the storm raging outside. He had just told her that she and her sister had saved him from a fate worse than death, not a death of the body, but of the spirit. They had filled the emptiness he had long accepted as his penance. Ayanna walked slowly from the window and sat on the braided rug before the hearth, tucking her legs beneath her. The warmth of the fire felt good on her skin. She was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his large body, to smell the scent of wood smoke and clean sweat that clung to him. They sat in silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now, filled with the weight of his confession. It was she who broke it, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her over the din of the rain. "The men who took us, Henderson," she began, her eyes focused on the hypnotic dance of the flames. "And the men in the town, Brody, they look at me and they see a thing, an animal, something to be used or tamed or put down." She paused, gathering her courage. "They do not see a woman." She risked a glance at him, her heart pounding. His face was a mask of pain and anger on her behalf. "When you look at me, Enoch, what do you see?" He swallowed hard, his throat working. "I see Ayanna," he whispered, as if the name itself was a prayer. "I see a woman with more strength in her heart than any 10 of those men. I see a survivor. I see beauty." The last word was barely audible, dragged from a place deep inside him that he had thought long dead. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with a longing that had been suppressed for weeks. It was a dangerous, volatile thing, born of loneliness and gratitude and a desperate, shared need to be seen for who they truly were. Ayanna's soul felt raw, laid bare by the storm and by their conversation. She had to know. She had to ask the question that had been haunting her own dark nights. She looked at him directly then, her gaze unwavering, her dark eyes searching his. "Have you ever thought of touching me?" The question struck him with the force of a physical blow. All the control, all the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart and his desires, crumbled to dust. His breath hitched. He had thought of nothing else for weeks. He had thought of it when he saw her brushing her hair, her arms raised, the line of her back strong and graceful. He had thought of it when she laughed at something Taji said, a rare, beautiful sound like wind chimes. He had thought of it when he saw the firelight catch the defiant spark in her eyes. He was a man, and he had been alone for a very long time. But it was more than that. He didn't just desire her body. He yearned for the fierce, wounded spirit within it. He couldn't speak. He could only nod, a single, jerky movement. And that was all it took. The thread of restraint snapped. He reached out, his hand trembling, and cupped her face. His calloused thumb stroked her cheekbone, a touch so reverent and gentle it was almost painful. It was not the touch of a captor, or a master, but of a worshipper. Ayanna closed her eyes, leaning into his palm, a shudder passing through her. It was the first gentle touch she had known from a man in years, a lifetime. He moved from the chair to kneel before her on the rug, his massive frame eclipsing the firelight. The outside world, with its rain and thunder and hatred, ceased to exist. There was only the small, sacred space between them, illuminated by the fire. He looked into her eyes, and she saw in his a reflection of her own desperate hunger, not just for the flesh, but for connection, for a moment of solace in a brutal world. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was the kiss of two lonely souls colliding in the dark. seeking warmth and life and a reason to keep fighting. It was freighted with all their shared sorrow, their unspoken fears, and their burgeoning, impossible hope. Her hands came up to tangle in his thick hair, pulling him closer, answering his raw need with her own. They came together not in a frenzy, but with a kind of profound, aching slowness. Every touch was a discovery, every caress a question and an answer. Their worn, simple clothes felt like barriers to be discarded, not in haste, but with a deep and trembling reverence for what lay beneath. In the flickering firelight, they saw each other not as white man and Apache woman, not as giant and survivor, but simply as a man and a woman, stripped bare of everything but their shared humanity and their overwhelming need. His hands, which she had seen gentle a horse and build a home, learned the landscape of her body, tracing the proud line of her jaw, the elegant curve of her neck, the strength in her shoulders. Her touch, in turn, was one of wonder, exploring the rugged terrain of his scars, the solid wall of his chest, the raw power that lay coiled in his muscles. It was an act of both desperate passion and profound healing, a silent vow made in the heart of the storm. They found in each other a shelter from their pasts, a fierce, burning light against the darkness, a place where, for a few stolen hours, they were not alone. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The morning broke, quiet and clean. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed and smelling of wet sage and rich earth. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes in the silent cabin. Ayanna woke first. She was curled on the rug, covered by a thick wool blanket, the embers of the fire still glowing faintly in the hearth. Enoch was already up. He stood by the stove, his back to her, fumbling with the coffee pot. His usual steady, deliberate movements were gone, replaced by a tense, awkward energy. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. An immense silence filled the room, heavier and more complex than any that had come before. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the silence of comfortable companions. It was the silence of two people who had crossed a line and did not know what lay on the other side. Enoch finally turned, a tin mug of coffee in his hand. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the floor, on the wall, on anything but her face. Ayanna, too, found she could not meet his eyes. She stared into the glowing embers, her heart a confusing mix of tenderness, fierce joy, and a deep, unsettling fear. It was not shame that kept them silent. It was terror. What had happened between them was not a simple act of lust. It was an earthquake. It had shaken the very foundations of their separate, broken worlds and fused them together. To feel this sense of belonging, to look at another person and see a home for your soul, was a terrifying vulnerability. It was a treasure so precious and fragile that they were both instantly afraid of it being shattered. For two people who had learned that love and connection only ever led to loss, this new feeling was a beautiful, dangerous thing, a wildflower blooming on the edge of a cliff. Taji's voice from the doorway broke the spell. The rain brought the creek back to life. She stood there, her eyes bright with the morning's wonder. She looked from Ayanna's still form by the fire to Enoch's rigid back by the stove. She saw the untouched blanket on Enoch's cot. She saw the new and unfamiliar expression on her sister's face, a strange combination of sorrow and light. She saw the way Enoch flinched, just slightly, at the sound of her voice. Taji did not know what had passed between them in the night, not with her mind, but her heart, wise beyond her years, understood everything. She sensed the invisible lines of energy that now connected them, the air that crackled with unspoken words. She knew that the ground beneath their feet had shifted while she slept, and saying nothing, she walked quietly to the water bucket, giving them the gift of her silence. The fragile peace that had settled over the ranch after the storm was a mirage. In Purgatory Flats, a town that thrived on suspicion and boredom, The story of Enoch Hale and the two Apache sisters had grown into a dark and twisted legend. It was whispered over watered-down whiskey in the saloons and clucked over by the tight-lipped women in the general store. The initial rumor of a mix-up had festered, nourished by Caleb Brody's resentful account of his visit. Now, the story was that the giant recluse, Madman Hale, had not been a victim of a mistake, but had intentionally acquired two savage women to satisfy his own unnatural appetites. His lie about them being his cousins was seen as proof of his depravity, a blasphemous attempt to legitimize a den of sin. The poison of these rumors inevitably seeped into the soul of the town's moral authority, the Reverend Gideon Blackwood. The Reverend was a tall, severe man with a face as narrow and unyielding as his interpretation of the Scripture. He saw the world in stark terms of light and darkness, salvation and damnation, and he believed it was his God-given duty to drag the lost souls of his parish, kicking and screaming if necessary, into the light. He heard the tales of Enoch Hale and saw not a lonely man, but a soul teetering on the brink of hell, ensnared by the dark temptations of the wilderness. One Tuesday morning, when the sun was high and hot, Ayanna saw a lone rider approaching. It was not a dusty vigilante this time, but a man in a black coat and hat, sitting stiffly astride a well-groomed mare. It was the Reverend Blackwood, coming to cast out the demons from Enoch Hale's homestead. Enoch met him on the porch, his face impassive. Ayanna and Taji remained in the cabin, out of sight but listening to every word through the open door. Mr. Hale, the Reverend began, his voice sonorous and filled with a practiced piety. He did not dismount, choosing to literally look down on Enoch. I have come as a shepherd to a straying member of his flock. I haven't been a member of your flock for a long time. Reverend, Enoch said, his voice flat. The Lord's flock is for all eternity. My son, and it is my duty to inform you that your immortal soul is in grave peril. Blackwood intoned, the town is awash with stories, Mr. Hale, vile stories of carnality and godlessness. They say you are keeping two heathen women here, against their will and against God's law. What folks say in that town is their business, Enoch said, his hands balling into fists at his sides. It becomes my business when it concerns the soul of a man I am sworn to guide. The Reverend insisted. I have come to offer you a path to redemption. Let these creatures go. Send them away, back to whatever reservation or wilderness they came from. Renounce this sin, and the Lord, in his infinite mercy, may yet forgive you. The condescension in his voice was a physical thing, a foul taste in the air. He spoke of them as if they were animals to be released, not people. Ayanna felt a familiar, cold rage begin to build in her chest. They are not creatures, Enoch said, his voice a low growl. And they are not captives. They are my family. Reverend Blackwood let out a sigh, a theatrical display of weary disappointment. You are more lost than I feared. Your lie about them being kin is an abomination, a mockery of the sacred bonds of family. You have been bewitched, son, seduced by savage ways. He peered past Enoch, trying to get a glimpse into the cabin's shadowy interior. Let me speak to the older one, the one they say has the eyes of a wolf. Perhaps I can appeal to whatever small flicker of decency she may possess. He finally dismounted and made to step onto the porch. Enoch moved, blocking his path with the solid wall of his body. You will not. Step aside. Mr. Hale, I am an instrument of the Lord. This is my home, Enoch said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. And you are not welcome in it. The Reverend's pious facade began to crack, revealing the raw prejudice beneath. His face flushed with anger. You would choose this darkness over the light of salvation. You would defile your Christian home and the memory of your good wife with this witch bride you've taken from the devil's own tribe. The words struck the air with the force of a whip. Asterisk witch bride? Asterisk. The insult was so venomous, so utterly dehumanizing, that for a moment, Ayanna could not breathe. It was the culmination of every hateful glance, every fearful whisper she had ever endured. It branded her not just as a savage, but as a source of evil, a temptress who had corrupted a good man. Enoch went absolutely still. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pale, taut mask of fury. The muscles in his neck and shoulders corded. He turned his head slowly and looked at the wall of the cabin beside the door, at the solid pine logs he had hewn and set with his own hands. And then, with a roar that seemed to be torn from the very center of the earth, he drew back his fist and punched it. The sound was like a pistol shot. Wood splintered, cracking under the force of the blow. The entire cabin seemed to shudder. The Reverend Blackwood stumbled back, his face white with shock and fear, his self-righteous anger instantly extinguished by this display of raw, terrifying violence. Enoch stood with his fist still buried in the wall he had built, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. He did not look at the Reverend. He did not say a word. The violence had said everything. Reverend Blackwood, trembling, scrambled back onto his horse. "May God have mercy on your damned soul," he stammered, before kicking his horse into a frantic gallop, fleeing the homestead as if the devil himself were at his heels. Ayanna stepped out of the cabin's shadows and into the light. Her eyes were fixed not on the retreating figure of the preacher, but on Enoch. He stood with his back to her, his head bowed, his bleeding hand hanging at his side. She was profoundly, deeply moved, shaken to her very core. She had seen men fight to possess her, to own her, to use her. She had never, in her life, seen a man unleash his rage in her defense. He had not argued with the Reverend. He had not spoken for her. He had simply refused to allow her honor to be trampled in his presence. His action was a shield, a wall of sinew and bone and righteous fury erected to protect her. She walked to him and gently took his hand. It was a mess of splintered wood and torn flesh. "Come inside," she said, her voice soft. "Let me clean this." He followed her like a man in a trance. She brought the water basin and a clean cloth and carefully, tenderly, began to wash the blood away and pick out the splinters. He submitted to her care, his eyes never leaving her face. The anger had drained out of him, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability. "They will not stop," he said, his voice hoarse. "The town, Blackwood, they will never leave us in peace." "We are strong," Ayanna said, wrapping a clean strip of linen around his wounded hand. "We have survived worse." "It's not enough," he said, his voice ragged with desperation. He captured her free hand, his grip surprisingly gentle. "Ayanna, my lie, it will not hold forever. They will come back." He looked at her, his pale blue eyes filled with a desperate, pleading light. "There is only one way to make them stop, one way to make this right in their eyes, to make this real." He took a deep breath. "Marry me, Ayanna, not in their church, not in their town, here, in this house. We will say the words to each other, before God. We do not need their blessing. We can make our own. We can be a family, a real family, that they cannot touch." His proposal was not one of romantic fantasy, but of desperate, defiant love. It was his ultimate act of protection, an offer to build a fortress of legitimacy around their fragile world, a fortress with his own name. He was offering her everything he was, everything he had, and it broke her heart to have to refuse him. She pulled her hand away, not with anger, but with a deep, sorrowful finality. A wall came down behind her eyes, the old, familiar wall of the survivor. "I cannot," she whispered. Enoch's face crumpled, the hope draining from his eyes, leaving them hollow. "Why? Do you not care for me?" "My heart, it is yours. Enoch, you know that it is," she said, and a tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "But I have been owned before. I have been sold. I have been treated like property, like a horse to be traded. All my life, I have fought not to belong to anyone." She looked at him, her gaze fierce and full of a terrible, unyielding pride. To marry, in your world, is for a woman to be a man's property, to take his name, to belong to him. I will not do it. Not even for you. She straightened to her full height, her voice clear and strong despite the tears in her eyes. I belong to no one. The words were her truth. They were the core of her spirit, the declaration of a soul that refused to be possessed. But to Enoch, they sounded like a verdict. He could not understand. He had offered her his name as a shield, and she had seen it as a cage. He had offered her his heart, and he thought she was telling him it was not enough. A profound, shattering grief washed over him. He stared at her for a long moment, his face a mask of heartbreak. Without another word, he turned and strode out of the cabin. He went to the corral, threw a saddle on Elijah with frantic, clumsy movements, and vaulted onto his back. He gave a wild, anguished cry and kicked the horse into a desperate gallop, riding away from the ranch, away from her, fleeing into the vast, indifferent wilderness as if trying to outrun the pain that was tearing him apart. Ayanna stood in the doorway and watched him go until he was nothing more than a speck of dust. The strength that had held her up moments before deserted her. Her knees buckled and she sank to the floor. And for the first time since the night of the storm, she wept. She cried for the pain she had seen in his eyes, for the beautiful, impossible thing he had offered her, and for the fierce, lonely freedom she could not, would not, surrender. Enoch returned at dusk the following day. He rode in slowly, Elijah coated in dust and sweat, the man and the horse a single, weary silhouette against the blood-red sunset. He did not look at Ayanna as he dismounted, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He tended to his horse, his movement stiff with unspoken pain, and then retreated into the main cabin, the door closing with a soft, final click. The days that followed were filled with a silence colder and heavier than any that had come before. The fragile bridge of understanding they had built between them had collapsed, leaving a chasm of misunderstanding. Enoch was a ghost in his own home. He rose before the sun, worked with a relentless, punishing ferocity until long after dark, and ate his meals alone, his back to the door of the room he had built for them. He was burying his heartbreak under a mountain of physical exhaustion. Ayanna's heart ached with a pain that was sharp and constant. She had spoken her truth, but in doing so, she had wounded the only man who had ever seen her as more than a savage or a possession. She watched him from a distance, saw the new lines of grief etched around his eyes, the slump in his broad shoulders. The joy had gone out of their small world, replaced by a polite, agonizing distance. This new cold reality was hardest on Taji. She felt the tension like a drop in temperature, a coming frost that threatened the first safe home she had ever known. The easy laughter she had begun to share with Enoch was gone. The carving lessons on the porch steps ceased. The ranch, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place of mourning. It was this instability that made her vulnerable to a new and unexpected possibility. About a month after the Reverend's visit, necessity forced Enoch and Ayanna into Purgatory Flats. A bolt on the plow had sheared, and it was a repair Enoch couldn't make himself. Taji, unwilling to be left alone in the oppressive silence, insisted on coming with them. As Enoch spoke in low tones with the blacksmith, Ayanna and Taji waited near the wagon. A young man emerged from the smithy, wiping soot from his brow with the back of his arm. He was perhaps a few years older than Ayanna, with earnest brown eyes and a shy, open face that was a stark contrast to the suspicious, hardened expressions of the other men in town. This was Matthew, the blacksmith's son. He had seen the sisters before, from a distance, but now, seeing Tazi up close, he was struck by her delicate beauty and the deep, soulful innocence in her eyes. He approached them, his movements hesitant. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he said, his gaze fixed on Taji. I just wanted to say, I don't hold with what the others in this town say. My father taught me a man is judged by his work, and a person by their heart, not by their skin. Taji, startled by the direct and kind address, could only stare. Ayana's hand instinctively went to the knife hidden in her skirt. "My name is Matthew," he continued, a faint blush rising on his cheeks. If you ever need anything from town, anything at all, you can send word. I'd be honored to help." Over the next few weeks, Matthew found reasons to ride out toward the Hale Ranch, ostensibly to check on a stray calf or inspect a distant fence line. He would meet Tazi by accident as she gathered wildflowers near the property's edge. He was gentle and respectful, bringing her small, clumsy gifts. A strangely shaped piece of quartz, a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree. He spoke to her of his dream to move further west, to California, where he'd heard the land was green and people were not so quick to judge. One afternoon, he made his offer. "Taji," he said, his voice earnest and trembling slightly, "this is no place for you. These people, they'll never accept you. And Hale, he's a good man, I reckon, but he's a haunted one. You could have a real life, a family. Come away with me. Let me take you to a place where you can be safe, where you can be happy." The offer was a seed of possibility that took root in Taji's lonely heart. She thought of a life without fear, without the constant threat of men like Caleb Brody, a life in a green and gentle place, with a kind man who looked at her with undisguised admiration. She was torn. That night, she confided in her sister, her voice a troubled whisper in the darkness of their room. "Matthew wants me to go away with him. Ayana, he says he can give me a good life." Ayana's heart clenched with fear. The thought of being separated from her sister, her only true family in the world, was unbearable. But she saw the flicker of hope in Tazi's eyes. "Is that what you want?" Ayana asked, her own voice strained. Taji was silent for a long time. "I don't know," she admitted. A part of me wants to go, to be normal, but," she hesitated. "But when the snake bit me, Matthew wasn't here. When the vigilantes came, he wasn't here." She turned to face Ayana in the dark, her voice gaining a strength her sister had never heard before. "Enoch was. He put his mouth to the poison for me. He stood against those men for us. He built this room for us with his own hands." She took a shuddering breath. "Matthew is a kind boy, but Enoch is a better man than all the men I have ever met. This is a hard place, sister, but he has made it safe. How can I leave?" Taji's words were a revelation to Ayana, through her younger sister's clear, simple wisdom. She saw the truth she had been refusing to accept. Enoch's love wasn't about possession. It was about protection. It wasn't about ownership. It was about sacrifice. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Enoch, driven by the need to work, to build, to impose order on his chaotic emotions, had started constructing a new, larger pen for the goats, further from the cabin. He worked alone, refusing Ayana's silent offers of help. He was wrestling a heavy corner post into place, a massive log of seasoned oak, straining against its weight. The ground, still soft in places from the great storm, gave way beneath his boot. He let out a sharp cry of pain as he fell, the log crashing down with him, its rough edge tearing a deep, ragged gash in his thigh before rolling clear. Ayana had been watching from the cabin. She was at his side in a heartbeat. He was trying to push himself up, his face pale and beaded with sweat, blood pouring from the wound, soaking his canvas trousers a dark, ugly red. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice steady and calm, betraying none of the panic she felt. She helped him lean back, then ran to the cabin for her supplies. She returned and, with a deft, practiced movement of her knife, slit his trouser leg from knee to hip, exposing the injury. It was deep, a brutal, gaping wound that would need stitching. "This will hurt," she said simply. He just nodded, his jaw clenched, his eyes squeezed shut. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, her touch light and sure. He did not flinch, though she could feel the tremors of pain running through his powerful body. She took out the fine sinew thread and the sharp bone needle she always kept with her, as she began the first stitch, drawing the torn flesh together. He sucked in a sharp breath. "Talk to me," she said softly, not looking up from her work. "Tell me something, anything." "My father," he began, his voice a strained rasp. "He was a blacksmith, like Matthew's. He had hands like shovels, but he could make the most delicate things from iron. A rose for my mother's birthday, the petals so thin you could almost see through them." He grimaced as she pulled another stitch tight. "He taught me that strength, true strength, is about what you can build, not what you can break." She worked in silence, her needle dipping and rising, her hands covered in his blood. She was mending him, her patient stitches a quiet refutation of the angry, wounded silence that had grown between them. When she was finished, she bandaged the wound tightly with clean linen. She helped him to his feet, his arms slung over her shoulders, his immense weight leaning heavily on her. They hobbled back to the cabin, a slow, painful journey that took an eternity. She got him onto his cot, brought him water, and sat in the chair beside him. For hours, he drifted in a feverish sleep. Ayana watched him, her heart overflowing with a feeling so powerful it almost suffocated her. This giant of a man, so strong and self-sufficient, was now completely helpless, completely dependent on her. The vulnerability in his sleeping face, the lines of pain eased by exhaustion, broke down the last of her defenses. Late that night, his fever subsided. He woke, his mind clear, and found her still there, her head resting on the edge of his cot, her hand loosely holding his. He gently squeezed her fingers. Her eyes fluttered open. They looked at each other in the soft lamplight, and the chasm between them was gone. There was no need for apologies or explanations. There was only a shared understanding, a quiet acceptance. She rose and gently pulled back the bandage to check her stitches. The bleeding had stopped. The flesh was already beginning to knit itself together. As she finished, her gaze fell on an old scar, a pale, jagged line high on his chest, visible where his shirt had been torn. It was a relic of his past, a wound from long before he had ever met her. On impulse, she leaned down. She pressed her lips to it, a soft, tender kiss. It was a kiss of acceptance, a reverence for all the pain he had carried alone for so long. He let out a shaky breath, and his uninjured hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. He gently drew her face up to his. This time, when he kissed her, there was no desperation, no storm. It was a kiss of infinite tenderness, of quiet homecoming. They came together again that night, not with the fiery, elemental crash of before, but with the slow, gentle flow of a river finding its way back to the sea. It was an affirmation. Every touch was a silent promise, every caress a prayer. It was a deliberate, conscious act of two souls choosing each other, mending each other. It was quiet and profound, and it healed them both. Later, as they lay tangled together in the narrow cot, the sound of his steady heartbeat a comforting drum beneath her ear. She felt a sense of peace so deep it was almost terrifying. She had spent her life running, fighting, resisting the idea of belonging anywhere or to anyone. But here, in this man's arms, in this small cabin in the middle of a harsh and unforgiving land, she felt a stillness in her spirit she had never known. She lifted her head and whispered into the darkness, the words as much a surprise to her as they were to him. "If there is a place called home, perhaps it does not have to be a piece of land from your ancestors." She pressed a soft kiss to his chest, just over his heart. "Maybe it begins right here." Outside, in the world beyond the cabin walls, the land itself seemed to be listening. The life-giving rain, which had fallen in such fury, had done its work. In the morning light, tiny, Vibrant green shoots could be seen pushing their way up through the cracked red earth. A pair of wrens, long absent, had begun to build a new nest in the rafters of the barn. The air felt lighter, cleaner, and filled with the promise of a new season. Life, against all odds, was beginning again. The world bloomed. In the weeks that followed Enoch's recovery, the ranch was transformed. It was no longer just a place of survival, but one of tentative, burgeoning life. Ayana's quiet declaration in the dark had changed everything. The silence that returned was not one of distance, but of deep, shared intimacy. They moved around each other with a new grace, their hands brushing as they passed, their eyes meeting over the supper table in glances that held entire conversations. Love, having been acknowledged, began to put down roots. Enoch, with Ayana now helping him, finished the goat pen and built a sturdy chicken coop. Taji, with a natural gift for nurturing, started a small garden near the cabin, coaxing stubborn rows of squash and beans from the thirsty earth. Laughter, once a rare and startling sound, became a more frequent visitor, usually prompted by Tazi's gentle teasing or Enoch's clumsy attempts to help with the gardening. They were building a life, not just a homestead. The three of them a strange and resilient constellation in the vast, empty wilderness. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a man who looked as though he belonged to a different world. He came not on a dusty horse, but in a handsome black-lacquered buggy pulled by a perfectly matched pair of gray mares. The man himself was tall and impeccably dressed in a fine wool suit, his boots polished to a high sheen despite the dust. He had a neatly trimmed beard, a gold watch chain draped across his vest, and cold, intelligent eyes that assessed everything. The cabin, the livestock, the sisters, with the calculating gaze of a merchant appraising goods. He pulled his buggy to a stop and stepped down, dusting his coat with a gloved hand. Enoch, who had been reinforcing a corral fence with Ayana, straightened up slowly, his body tensing. He recognized the scent of trouble, and this man reeked of it. "A fine piece of land," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, entirely out of place in the rustic setting. "Though a bit remote for my tastes, I am looking for Enoch Hale." "You've found him," Enoch said, his voice a low rumble. The man smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Excellent. My name is Bartholomew Thorne, and I believe you have something that belongs to me." His cold eyes flicked dismissively over Ayana and then to Taji, who had come out of the garden, her hands still smudged with dirt. "I have nothing that belongs to you," Enoch said, taking a half-step forward, placing himself between the man and the sisters. Thorne chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I think you do. You see, I had an arrangement, an order, placed with an agency back east, for 2 healthy, hard-working women to be delivered to my new mining concern up in the mountains. Imagine my surprise when they never arrived. And my agent, a rather unreliable fellow named Henderson, vanished with a portion of my money. It has taken me some time to trace the error." He produced a folded piece of paper from his inner coat pocket. "A bill of sale, Mr. Hale, for 2 indentured servants, described as orphaned sisters. My property, and they, I believe, are standing right behind you." The blood drained from Ayana's face. This was him, the man who had actually bought them, the final destination of their long, nightmarish journey. He spoke of them as if they were mules or sacks of flour. Enoch's hands clenched into fists. His leg, though healed, gave a sharp, warning twinge. "There was a mistake," he said, his voice tight. "These women were brought here by that mistake. They are not property." "A mistake I am here to rectify," Thorne said smoothly, his smile tightening. "I am a reasonable man. You've provided them with food and shelter, for which I suppose I am grateful. I am prepared to overlook your part in this unfortunate diversion. Simply hand over my assets, and we can all be on our way." Ayana felt a cold dread mixed with a white-hot fury. After everything, the fear, the pain, the slow, difficult process of building a new life, it was all to be undone by this man with his piece of paper and his soulless eyes. Enoch did not move. He seemed to grow larger, his presence as solid and unyielding as the granite bedrock beneath their feet. "They are not assets," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They are people, and they are home." Thorn's polite demeanor finally cracked. A flash of irritation crossed his face. "Do not play the simpleton with me. Hale, the law is the law. I have a contract. What you have is possession of stolen goods. I can have you charged with kidnapping, with theft. I can have this entire pathetic ranch seized as collateral." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. "Do you really want to find out how powerful my lawyers are?" Enoch looked past the man, at Ayanna. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw the defiant fire he had come to love. He saw Taji clutching a handful of her skirt, her knuckles white. He saw the life they had built, the fragile bloom in the desert, and he knew he would rather die than see it trampled. He turned his gaze back to Thorn, his pale eyes as hard as diamonds. "I did not buy anyone," he said, each word clear and deliberate. "They choose to stay." Thorn stared at him, his mouth agape, utterly baffled that this backwoods giant would dare to defy him. A dark, cold rage settled in his eyes. "You will regret this," he said, his voice trembling with fury. He climbed back into his buggy, snapped the reins, and rode off in a cloud of angry dust, leaving the threat hanging in the air like a death sentence. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thorn was true to his word. He returned 2 days later, but this time he was not alone. He rode at the head of a small, grim procession. Beside him was a slick, rat-faced man in a suit he introduced as his lawyer. Behind them were 4 hired gunslingers, hard-faced men with pistols tied low on their hips, their eyes empty of everything but a cold readiness for violence. And trailing behind them, drawn by the promise of a spectacle, were a half-dozen men from Purgatory Flats, including Caleb Brody, his face alight with smug anticipation. Thorn had turned his personal dispute into a public crusade, framing Enoch as a lawbreaker and a menace who was defying the natural order of things. They reined in their horses, forming a semicircle in front of the cabin. A jury and execution squad rolled into one. "Enoch Hale," Thorn's voice boomed across the yard. "By the authority of the law, I am here to reclaim my legal property and to see you answer for your crimes." Enoch emerged from the cabin, his rifle held loosely in one hand. Ayanna was right behind him, her face pale but resolute. He had told her to hide, but she had refused. "Whatever comes," she had said, "we face it together. There is no law here but what you paid for." "Thorn!" Enoch called out, his voice steady. "Ride out and leave us be." "The time for talk is over," Thorn snarled. He nodded to the gunslingers. "He is resisting. Subdue him." The 4 men dismounted and advanced, fanning out. Enoch raised his rifle, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. He was also not a killer. He fired a single warning shot into the dirt at their feet. It was a mistake. It was the excuse they needed. They rushed him. The fight was brutal, short, and ugly. Enoch swung his rifle like a club, knocking one man senseless, but another slammed the butt of his pistol into Enoch's already injured leg. He roared in pain, his leg buckling beneath him. As he fell, the others were on him, their boots and fists rising and falling with sickening, rhythmic thuds. Ayanna screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony. She tried to run forward, but Taze held her back, sobbing. The men from town watched, their faces a mixture of excitement and fear. Brody was grinning. From the ground, Enoch fought back, a wounded bear trying to fend off a pack of wolves, but his strength was failing. A final, vicious kick to the head, and he lay still, a bloody, broken mess in the dust. "Now," Thorne said, a triumphant sneer on his face as he dismounted. "The property." He started walking toward the porch, where Ayanna and Taji stood clinging to each other. "There's no need for any more unpleasantness. Girls, your little adventure is over." Something inside Ayanna snapped. The fear, the grief, the years of rage. It all coalesced into a single, incandescent point of pure, cold clarity. She was not property. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. She was a warrior, and they had hurt her man. She pushed Taji gently behind her. "Stay here," she whispered. She turned and slipped back into the cabin. Her eyes scanned the room and fell upon Enoch's rifle, dropped by the door. Her hands did not tremble as she picked it up. It felt heavy, solid, real. She checked the load. She walked back to the doorway and raised the rifle to her shoulder, the iron sights lining up perfectly on Bartholomew Thorne's chest. Her movement was so sudden and unexpected that everyone froze. The hired guns, the lawyer, the men from town. They all stopped and stared at the Apache woman who now held all of their lives in her hands. Her face was a mask of cold fury, her eyes burning with a fire that seemed hot enough to melt steel. "Get away from him," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with it the chilling authority of the grave. Thorne stopped, his eyes wide with disbelief and a flicker of fear. "Put that down, you foolish girl. You don't know how to use that." "My father taught me to hunt before I could weave," Ayanna said, her voice deadly calm. The rifle did not waver. "I can put a bullet through a fly's eye at 50 paces. Your heart is a much larger target." A stunned silence fell over the yard. The men looked at each other, then back at her. This was not the frightened savage they had imagined. This was something else entirely. Ayanna's gaze swept over the gawking men from Purgatory Flats. "You came here to pity the poor Indian girls, held captive by the madman," she called out, her voice ringing with contempt. "You came to watch us be dragged away like cattle?" She took a step forward, out onto the porch, into the full sunlight. "I need no pity from any of you." She looked directly at Thorne, her eyes blazing, and then she made the declaration that sealed her fate, and theirs. She said the word she had once refused, but now claimed as a shield, as a sword, as a vow. "I am his wife." The words dropped into the silence like a boulder into a still pond. Before anyone could react, Taji stepped out from behind her, her face streaked with tears but her eyes shining with a fierce, proud love. She stood beside her sister, facing the hostile crowd, and her clear, young voice rang out. "An Apache heart knows how to love." The two statements, one a defiant claim of place and the other a simple declaration of universal truth, struck the crowd with more force than a bullet. They saw two women, standing side by side, willing to die for the broken man lying in the dust. They saw a love so fierce and so undeniable that it shamed their own petty hatreds. Thorne, for the first time in his life, was at a complete loss. He was a man of contracts, of laws, of money. He knew how to bully and bribe and threaten. He had no weapon against this. This was a force he could not comprehend, a love he could not buy. He looked from Ayanna's unyielding face to the rifle pointed at his chest, to the beaten man on the ground, and he knew he was defeated. He backed away, shaking his head in disgust and disbelief. "You're all mad," he muttered. He gestured to his men. "Leave it. She's not worth dying for." He climbed back into his buggy and rode away, his lawyer and hired guns following sheepishly behind. The men from town, their appetite for sport gone, shuffled their feet and began to disperse, refusing to meet the gaze of the two women on the porch. As the last rider disappeared, the strength that had held Ayanna up seemed to drain away. The rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She lowered it, let it fall to the wooden porch, and ran, stumbling, to Enoch's side, her world shrinking to the sight of his bruised and bloodied face. A month passed. The raw wounds of the confrontation healed, leaving scars that told a story of survival. Enoch's body, battered and broken, mended with a slow, stubborn resilience that mirrored the land itself. Ayana's stitches held true, and with her constant care, poultices made from desert herbs, nourishing broths, and a quiet, unwavering presence, he regained his strength. The deep bruises on his spirit faded too, replaced by a profound and peaceful certainty. The battle had been brutal, but it had burned away all doubt, all fear, all the ghosts of his past. He was no longer a man living with loss. He was a man living for love. The violent intrusion of Thorn and his men had paradoxically cleansed the air. The stand Ayana had taken, her rifle steady and her voice ringing with a truth more powerful than any legal document, had silenced the town of Purgatory Flats. It was not that their prejudice had vanished, but it had been cowed, forced into the shadows by a display of courage so raw and undeniable, it commanded a grudging respect. No one rode out to the Hill Ranch anymore. It had become a place set apart, a territory governed by its own laws of loyalty and love. With peace came the quiet, steady work of building. The hole Enoch had punched in the cabin wall was the first thing they repaired, working together to fit a new, smooth plank into place. The act was symbolic. They were mending the breach, making their home whole again. Their shared work became a language of its own, a silent conversation spoken in the rhythmic thud of a hammer, the scrape of a hoe, the gentle murmur of encouragement. They expanded Tazi's garden, clearing a larger patch of land near the well. Enoch, his leg now strong enough, broke the hard soil with the repaired plow, his powerful shoulders straining against the earth. Ayana and Tazi followed behind, their hands working in tandem to plant seeds, their knowledge of the land, his of its stubbornness, theirs of its hidden potential, blending together. They were not just planting vegetables, they were planting a future, a belief in seasons of harvest yet to come. They added a dozen new chickens to their flock, their cheerful clucking filling the mornings with a sound of simple, domestic life. Enoch, with Ayana's help, undertook a new project. He began to clear a small, direct path from the cabin down to the stream that now gurgled with a steady, year-round flow since the great storm. He moved rocks, uprooted stubborn creosote bushes, and smoothed the earth. It was hard, back-breaking work, but it was joyful. Every stone he moved, every root he tore from the ground, felt like clearing the obstacles from their own lives. He was creating an easier path for her, for Taji, a way to the life-giving water without scrambling over rocks and through thorns. One afternoon, as they worked on the path, they saw riders approaching. For a heart-stopping moment, the old fear returned, but these were not vigilantes or hired guns. It was a small, weary group of 4. An older man, a woman, and 2 young men, their clothes patched, their face etched with hardship. They led 2 pack mules laden with their meager belongings. They were of mixed blood, their features a blend of Apache and Mexican heritage, a people who belonged to neither world and were rejected by both. They stopped at a respectful distance, and the old man dismounted, his movements slow and tired. "We are looking for the Hale place," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. "This is it," Enoch said, his hand resting warily on the handle of his axe. The old man nodded, his gaze taking in the well-tended garden, the sturdy cabin, the path they were building. He looked at Enoch, a white man, standing beside Ayana, an Apache woman. He saw no fear between them, only a quiet partnership. "We have traveled many weeks," the man said, his voice heavy with the weight of his journey. "We heard a story, in a settlement to the south, a story about a giant of a man and his Apache wife, who stood together against a rich man and his guns. They said this was a place where a person was judged by their heart, a place where outcasts might find a welcome." He looked at Enoch, his dark, tired eyes filled with a desperate, fragile hope. "We are good workers. We ask for nothing but a chance to earn our keep and a safe place to lay our heads. Is the story true? Is this such a place? Enoch looked at Ayanna. He saw in her eyes the reflection of his own thoughts. He saw the memory of her own arrival, lost and terrified. He saw the truth of what they had become. Their small, personal struggle had sent a ripple of hope out into the world, a signal fire for others who were lost in the dark. The story is true, Ayanna said, her voice clear and strong, answering for them both. You are welcome here. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The sun was setting, painting the vast western sky in brilliant, breathtaking strokes of orange, purple, and gold. A month after the newcomers had arrived, the ranch was alive. The two young men proved to be tireless workers, and their mother a genius with the garden and the chickens. The old man, whose name was Mateo, had a quiet wisdom and a deep knowledge of the land that complemented Enoch's own. The silence of the ranch had been replaced by a low, pleasant hum of activity, of life being lived. Enoch and Ayanna stood on the small hill behind the cabin, the one where a single, simple cross marked Sarah's grave. They often came here in the evenings. It was not a place of sadness, but of quiet reflection. Ayanna had never felt a moment of jealousy for the woman buried there. She felt only a deep, abiding gratitude for the love that had shaped the man she now stood beside. They stood hand in hand, looking down at the small world they had built. They saw the cabin, its windows glowing with the warm light of the lamps within. They saw the expanded garden, a patch of determined green against the red earth. They saw the smoke rising from the small adobe hut Mateo and his family had built for themselves near the stream. They saw a place of refuge, a sanctuary. Enoch turned to look at Ayanna. The light of the setting sun caught in her black hair, framing her face in a halo of gold. The fierce warrior he had first seen was still there in the proud line of her jaw. But her eyes, once filled with suspicion and grief, now held a deep, serene peace. They held the reflection of his own love. He drew her closer, his heart so full of a quiet, overwhelming joy that it felt as if it might break. All the years of loneliness, all the pain and the silence, had been a long, hard winter that he had thought would never end. But she had been his spring. She had brought the rain that had washed it all away and allowed life to grow again. He leaned down, his lips close to her ear, his voice a low, rough whisper against the vast silence of the desert. You came to the wrong place, he said, his voice thick with emotion, acknowledging the cruel twist of fate that had brought her to his door. But you came at the right time. He felt her hand tighten in his. She leaned her head against his shoulder. A perfect fit. He looked out at the horizon, at the last fiery sliver of sun dipping below the distant mountains. And he added the final, essential truth of his own journey. So did I. And in the gathering twilight, they stood together, two souls who had been sent astray, only to find their true path in each other. Theirs was a love born not of grand design or gentle courtship, but forged in the harsh fires of prejudice and survival. It was a testament to the stubborn, unkillable hope that can bloom in the most desolate of landscapes. A quiet truth whispered on the wind, that even in a land of cracked earth and broken hearts, the deepest wounds can be healed, and a home can be built, not of wood or stone, but of the simple, unshakable love of two people who chose to stand together against the world. Thank you for listening to our story. We're curious, where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to connect with you. Please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, for more stories like this. And don't forget to share your thoughts. We appreciate every one of you.